One of the good things about the pulse world, though, and lupins in particular, is it is looking up at the moment. The prospects are improving and the interest is growing, so we're not going to remain as being a small and uninteresting part of the industry. It actually is improving, and we're going to see some results in area this year. Just to start off with, I'd like to thank the Updates Committee for the opportunity to come and talk to you about pulses and the performances of the different varieties in 2014 and what that means for selections for 2015 and beyond. I'd also like to acknowledge GRDC's support of Pulse Australia in our endeavours to provide good messages and extension to the farming world. Now, just as a reminder to everybody, the lupin ag zones are different to the ag zones for every other crop. Lupins like to be a little bit individual, but this is how the statisticians drew it up, so you can make reasonable comparisons. So this is just to get in your own mind which patch you're interested in and how that compares to your usual ag zones. And I'll be referring to these as we go. As you might know, the 2014 season was a bit awkward. It was far too hot and dry in August in the northeastern wheat belt and the eastern wheat belt. It was barely moist in Esperance through winter, but they came home with a good finish. The western Kwinana zone, the west coast basically, and through the Great Southern had a marvellous season, and we had some yields accordingly. Lupins around the 3 tonne mark where there were no soil constraints and good moisture. Perhaps 1 kilometre away, charcoal rot, drought, heat and a few other things, and reduced yields to barely half a tonne. So a season of contrasts, but a season that did show up some very good yields for lupins and the varieties that we'd like to grow and recommend. So I'm not going to go through individual trials. That data is easily downloaded on the NVT site, but it's much more useful to look at long-term yields and how the genetic base is improving to the point where lupins are becoming a little bit more profitable. This data came online a couple of weeks ago, and it's all there for you to access. What I have done, just to make sure you remember where you live, is I've put the locations of the lupin zones up there so you don't lose track of where you live. What I want to point out in this data is not so much what the individual numbers are, but just how consistent they are for individual varieties, and the success that the Lupin Breeding Program has brought to the Western Australian grains industry through its efforts, in that the current varieties, the currently released varieties, are the top yielders over time, and they're very, very consistent and reliable. PBA Barlock was released last year, and it is the top yielder in Lupin Zone 1 and 2, mainly because of its anthracnose tolerance. But the acceptance of Barlock across the wheat belt, where it's been shown and in a lot of cases tried, is indicating that people are very, very happy with its performance, and it's going to become a variety that's going to be grown quite widely. Ganyidi was released in 2011, and you can see that its performance is pretty good in Lupin Zones 3, 4 and 5, where is the highest yielding, only a little bit ahead of Barlock in some cases, but still a significantly higher yielding. Barlock is the best in Lupin Zone 6 and 7. And then on the south coast we have Genebillup as the highest yielding variety, mainly due to its tolerance to bean yellow mosaic virus. Now, just to show the acceptance of these varieties, not only around about yield, but we can also show that farmer acceptance is growing of the new varieties as well. Mandlup in 2012 was still 70% of the lupin area in Western Australia. As of last year, it was down to 48% and falling. Ganyidi, released only a couple of years ago, is already at 17% of the lupin area. Even an old variety like Coromup is ticking along very nicely, and it's got a good acceptance in the Minginoo area. Started out at 8% in 2012 with the data that I have. It was released about 2007, I believe, and it's now up to 18%. And that's because it has a good acceptance within the lupin food industry because of its higher protein. And Genebillup is started at 3% in 2012, is now at 6% of the area, mainly across the south coast. And I saw a very good example of its resistance to bean yellow mosaic virus last year at Boyett Brook. A farmer had barlock in the paddock and Gennabillup. Previously he had a wipeout to Mandelup to bean yellow mosaic virus in about 2009, but this new variety showed promise, so he tried it, and Gennabillup beat it by 300 kilos over a 3-tonne yield, just because of bean yellow mosaic virus. Quite big holes through both sides of the paddock, but far more effect in the barlock. So it's not always about yield, sometimes it's about other characteristics, and with Gennabillup in particular, bean yellow mosaic virus in the high rainfall southwest and south coast areas is certainly worth considering, and if you're going to make a recommendation, you'd go with Gennabillup. So the point out of this little table basically to take home is that the genetic gain that's been made in the lupin breeding program is strong, and the varieties that have been released in the last few years are by far higher yielding over time than their predecessors. You might notice, of course, that Corrymup doesn't quite rate there, but you can't have yield and protein in a lupin. You've got to have one or the other. So in this case, while Corrymup is 18% of the lupin area, it's because of the marker that it's going into, and in some cases paddock performance is very good as well. One other point I wanted to make about Gunyiddi is that when Gunyiddi was released, it was basically released to replace Mandelup because of its ability to not shed pods, which is one of Mandelup's great failings, and that was the reason for picking it up. It contained about maybe 0.5% yield improvement, nothing significant, nothing to the point where you'd choose it just on that basis, but on the data that we've got in front of us here, it's actually doing a bit better than that, so you're getting yield gain plus retaining your pods. So what's to look forward to? And as I said, the genetic gain that we've received so far in our commercial varieties is really, really good, and we can look forward to even better ones soon. We're going to be considering 2 varieties in the next little while for potential release, and if they go ahead, you'll hear about it through autumn and certainly through spring. The first one is 2385, which has been high yielding in all the lupin breeding trials for perhaps the last 5 years. It's been a front runner for quite some time, and while we're excited about Barlock and Gunyiddi as being good high yielding varieties with lots of acceptance around the world, if you look at state rankings, 2385 is at least another 2% to 4% higher again. It is only an average protein accumulator, so if protein is an important part of the world for you, then 2385 is there for the traditional markets for lupins. But if you're into the food market and protein is particularly important to you, you might be more interested in 2428, which we will be considering. It comes with more protein than Corrymup. Corrymup's around about 1.5% to 2% higher currently than our standard varieties. 2428 is another percent higher again, but it's higher yielding than Corrymup. So actually, if Corrymup has shown such strong adaptation to the some of those Mingenew sand areas, with a bit of luck 2428 will show adequate adaptation as well. And on the data that we have so far for the 2004 state rankings from this year, we've got about potentially a 10% yield increase with higher protein. I'm sure it won't quite equal 10% in the commercial world, but it's significant from the point of view of those feeding into the markets that like Corrymup. And behind those varieties, if you look at the lupin breeding data that's available, that you want to talk to John Clements about, there are quite a number of varieties yielding higher again. So for the next few years, certainly not every year, but in the next few years we will certainly be seeing varieties coming through with much higher yields, more disease resistance, greater herbicide tolerance, and the future for lupin breeding is good, or production is good, from the efforts of the lupin breeding team. We'll just move on now to chickpea. Once again, long-term yield data. If I was to put up the 2014 yield data for chickpea, well, it wouldn't be worth showing actually, because it was very, very low yielding. It was in the northeast area from Mingenew across to Mullewa, and the yields were particularly low. A couple of trials were unmeasurable from the yield point of view, even though they had quite good growth. So unfortunately, I can't show the 2014 data, but the long-term data that's available from NVT again shows that our best two varieties are the two recently released varieties in PBA Striker, Pulse Breeding Australia that is, and Neelam, which came out of the COGO-funded chickpea breeding program which finished a few years ago. And the good thing I wanted to point out here is that Sonali is an old cold-tolerant variety which was very, very popular before Ascochyta blight arrived in 1998. And we haven't had varieties actually out-yielding Sonali. It actually has been the benchmark for yield, but of course being very susceptible is never going to make it from a production point of view anymore. But now we have two varieties which don't have cold tolerance and are now out-yielding it. If we can get cold tolerance into our breeding program, and we know the breeders are working on that, then we have the potential for those yields to jump again. The yields, of course, of chickpea are smaller than we'll find in other pulses, and so they do require very good market support to make them attractive to growers. The other thing they need, of course, is a consistent season so that people have the confidence to grow them and the wherewithal to take that extra little production risk with an alternative crop, and we just haven't had that over the last few years, particularly in that northern wheat belt where they're most suited, where it's warmer through spring than it is further south. So we have had some very good yields in 2011 and 2013, but in between those 2 years we've had some very ordinary seasons from a chickpea point of view. One thing to point out about chickpeas with PBA Striker and Neelam, and if we can go down to PBA Slasher and Genesis 510, we've got Ascochyta resistance of moderately resistant to resistant. So from the point of view of the disease risk, we actually are quite happy to say we don't have a disease risk from Ascochyta blight in Western Australia with chickpeas if you choose virtually any of those varieties, but certainly if you choose our resistant varieties in Neelam. And we believe the MR of PBA Striker is more than adequate for our environment. That's provided you follow the disease package. In the last 3 seasons I've seen Ascochyta blight growing quite happily on Striker, but that's invariably been because it's been planted without a seed dressing of Thiram, and it has carried with it a small seed amount of Ascochyta blight, which has allowed the disease to develop on the plant. Not to the point of necessarily cutting back production, but certainly producing a lot of risk for using that seed in the next and subsequent crops. So we've no particular risk from disease with PBA Striker and Neelam, and the genetic gain, once again, as we said with the lupins, is quite evident in the data. Our new varieties well and truly on top by significant amounts compared to our older varieties, and the benchmark in this particular case is Genesis 836, which was released in 2005. It's a intermediate MSMR variety to Ascochyta blight, and even that amount of Ascochyta resistance is adequate in most cases in the northern wheat belt, provided you take care of the basic hygiene for planting seed. And we're significantly higher in long-term yield gains with the newer varieties than we are with Genesis 836. So with that, I think chickpeas certainly have a role to play. They just need that little bit of confidence from some more consistent rainfall, and they need a bit more market support. And fortunately, we've seen a little bit of that improve just recently, but I'll have more to say on the market shortly. If we just move quickly to field peas, excuse me a moment. Most people have the capacity with pulses to grow one variety. They're not really in a position where the crop's big enough to even consider 2 varieties to suit different seasonal conditions, whether it's the start or the length of the season or the rotation. So if you're looking for an all-rounder, I really can't ask you to go anywhere past PBA Gunya. Its performance across all ag zones, and once again we're back to the normal ag zones, sorry, not the lupin ag zones, normal ag zones. PBA Gunya is the top yielding variety across the board on the long-term yield data. Nothing wrong with PBA Wharton as far as being equal to PBA Gunya. Wharton was only released 2 years ago, Simon? Yep, 2 years ago. Gunya was released about 4 years ago. Wharton has resistance to pea seed-borne mosaic virus, which has been quite prevalent in the Esperance area and certainly has been shown in trials to be quite devastating for yields. Commercially, I don't think we've quite seen PBA Wharton demonstrate that, and the fact that it's at least equal yielding, if not slightly behind other varieties, would indicate that perhaps pea seed-borne mosaic virus doesn't have quite the commercial impact that we were thinking about it was doing with the trial work that was done. So from the point of view of a preferred variety, it's very hard to go past Gunya. The old variety Casper, which is now probably 12 years old, still works very, very well in long seasons. If you have the opportunity to plant Casper early-ish or understand that you're going to have a potentially long spring, Casper will still give you some of the highest yields of field pea varieties. Just to mention PBA Pearl at the bottom, very high yielding, but it's a white pea, hence the name Pearl, and does need some specialist marketing if you're moving it into a birdseed or human food market. If it's into a feed market, that's fine, but it won't be a CBA segregation. So just be wary of PBA Pearl from the point of view of getting it off the farm. But not from a yield point of view, it does perform very well. So just quickly then on just where the markets are going at the moment, look, one of the reasons that lupins have got a little bit more of a headline act at the moment is because of price. It's been over $300 of a tonne for several years now. I know that growers are selling it for much more than that off the farm at the moment, and so there's some interest in that from that point of view. And yields have been moving up quite well, so gross margins have been very, very productive, and in some cases, well, a lot of cases on the west coast in front of cereal production. Chickpea is down. The market's been very subdued for some time. It's risen recently because of the potential for less area and a need for more imports from India. And so with the current price around $600 a tonne, I'd like to think that chickpeas, certainly in the East Coast, will improve in area in 2015. And similarly with field peas, just because of that need for imports from India, the field pea price is going to remain quite high. So they're the key messages. I think I've probably run through them pretty well already, but there are really only three choices of lupin that I can see, depending on which part of the wheat belt you're in, or whether you are looking for anthracnose tolerance, particularly in Barlock, or you're looking for a variety of lupin like Gunyeti, which tends to finish quite quickly and give you the opportunity to achieve crop topping, weed control, and get the crop ready to go a little bit sooner than you would do otherwise. And Jenna Billup for the south coast, where bean yellow mosaic virus is a real threat. Gunya as an all-rounder for field peas, PBA Wharton perhaps on the south coast, where you're concerned about pea seed-borne mosaic virus, and Striker and Neelam for chickpeas. From the market point of view, it's all looking quite firm. I think there's optimism for 2015 pricing because of particularly the Indian situation. 2 minutes? Okay, just want to quickly run through some survey work that Paul Carmody has conducted, funded by DAFRA and the GRDC, and see Paul's arrived in the audience, so if I say anything wrong, Paul, please pull me up and you can take the questions. What's changed in 6 years? One of the interesting things about this work is that it confirms to some degree what we already know. Canola has jumped in area compared to what it was in 2001-07, and this is an average of 2008-14. Currently canola in 2014 is more like 14% of the total cropped area in WA, not 9% average. And lupins here 4% average over that time, but it's more like 3% in 2014. When you go to the numbers, more recent numbers, the changes are even more dramatic. Field peas haven't changed very much, and oats have jumped nicely because of improved varieties and good pricing. So most growers are growing a bit of canola. Weed and disease control and rotational benefits are important, and that's just the similar result that Paul was getting in 2008. And 60% of farmers are still looking for general break crop information, varieties, soil quality, frost tolerance, particularly in southern areas, and drought tolerance. So I don't know that that's necessarily a huge change. And if we just go to some of the changes quickly for people looking for break crops to be a profitable crop in their own right, that's risen from 76% to 85%, and that would be principally across canola, but everybody expects break crops to be profitable. And there's a decrease in the reliance on the break crop to provide nitrogen to the crop. You know, the price of nitrogen is still at a point where buying it in is seen as a reasonable strategic thing to do rather than to be growing it yourself. And with the likelihood to grow break crops in 2015 and beyond, 100% of wheat lupin growers, as you might expect if they are wheat lupin growers, are going to be growing a break crop. There'll be a few canola guys in that, no doubt. The intensive croppers once again have gone from 87 to 95%. The amount of continuous wheat is certainly declining because of disease and yellow spot in particular, but we're seeing crown rot being spoken about a fair bit as well. So there's lots of reasons to move away from intensive cereal rotations and include a break crop in the process. But even down to the mixed croppers and the people with livestock, the people in mixed farming are still looking for a range of crops to spread their production risk rather than just going with cereals. Livestock growers, not necessarily, but that wouldn't be surprising because livestock is more profitable than it was in that period of 2001 to 2007. And with a good pasture legume in the system, they don't need necessarily a break crop. So 2 points to make. The oat industry certainly needs to do some work from the work that Paul's come up with. They need to promote the benefits from oat production to improve yield and quality. And I think one of the things that Peter might appreciate, the department does need to celebrate some of the successes of break crop research over the past 30 to 40 years and the extension initiatives that have been providing growers with the right attitudes and knowledge about what break crops can do for them. And one thing that I appreciate when I talk with farmers across the state is that you will never find, or rarely find, anybody who doesn't think that there's a benefit to having break crops in the system. It's just a question of whether they can make enough money to have them in the system as opposed to not. And there's my little advert. 2016 is going to be a big year for any of the grower groups around the place that would... Travis, you'll be into this. Any of the grower groups around the place that would like to help promote pulses for 2016, we'd certainly be keen to have things in the paddock, activities through 2016 which promotes not only the agronomy of pulses but the food and health benefits that go with it. And I'll leave it just there. Paul Carmody's in the audience for questions about survey people, and I'm happy to take questions about pulse yields in 2014, and thank you very much for your attention.